Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome again to this World River and Delta System Source to Think webinar series. And this is Paul Liu from NC State University. This webinar series is co-sponsored by NSF, NC State University, Louisiana State University, and East China Normal University in Shanghai, and Utrecht in Netherlands, and also MDS community model community. And today we are very happy to invite Professor Bob Hilton from University of Oxford to come here talk about the emission of CO2 and the weathering and the net carbon budget of a river catchment. So before I introduce Bob, as always, this is the number 108 talks we have in this webinar series, almost 2 years. All previous talks, including this talk, will be archived in our YouTube channel. So please feel free to use as a great resources for your teaching and research. And at the same time, we also maintain Source to Think Twitter account. As you can see, we announced all the news, new publication, or seminar, webinar announcement. And next Wednesday, we have our guest speaker also from University of Oxford, Emily. She will come here talk about geomorphologic change and the risk dynamic of Bangladesh. So please mark your calendar. And as I mentioned, Bob currently is a professor in the Department of Earth Science, University of Oxford. He graduated from University of Cambridge with a master and a PhD, then a postdoc at the Institute of Physics du Globe, IPG, Paris, and also a short visit guest professor, Switzerland, ETH, and then is a lecturer, reader, and professor in University of Durham. Then 2002 years last year, he moved to Oxford. So he's a geochemist, study exchange of the carbon between atmosphere and the rock, particularly focus on the river basin side from the source point of view. And kind of the trace element proxy for weathering and isotope. So I think Bob, we are looking forward to your talk. Now you can share your screen and put presentation mode.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for the invitation to speak and for all of the efforts that you and your wider team put into running this this really great series. And today I'm going to be talking about the kind of specific component of how weathering and erosion impact larger scale cycles. So in source to sink terms, we're thinking about this cascade of material from uplands or source areas of erosion and downstream. And actually, I'm interested in the kind of chemical reactions and exchange, the biochemical reactions that happen that result in carbon transfers through that kind of cascade. And one of the things that we've been focusing on trying to better constrain is this release of carbon dioxide when we weather sedimentary rocks. And I'll come on to the details of what's happening here in a few slides. And the image behind here is one of our field locations, actually in this case, a small catchment where we're looking at quite detailed process understanding at the kind of outcrop scale. But we also think about bigger picture. And I'll just flag, obviously, the funders, ERC funded the ROC CO2 project, and the Natural Environment Research Council UK have funded elements of this as well. And the postdocs and PhD students who've worked at Durham and Oxford on these themes, I'll be talking quite a lot about work that Guillaume Soulet, Mathieu Dillinger, Tobias and Katie have been working on. So without further ado, why are we doing this? Why do we care? Here we're thinking about the role of erosion and weathering playing a really critical role in the long-term carbon cycle, whereby this emission of CO2 from volcanism has to be dealt with. Otherwise, we end up with increasing CO2 and carbon content in the ocean, the atmosphere, and we know that this hasn't happened. So there must be mechanisms. Sorry, someone might have a microphone. We know that this buildup of CO2 hasn't happened, and so that we must have mechanisms that draw the CO2 back down. And so the kind of textbook view that we might take is through the inorganic carbon cycle, where we think about silicate minerals being broken down through carbonic acid, which involves drawing CO2 down from the atmosphere and transferring the carbon in dissolved form eventually to the oceans, where that carbon can be locked into calcium carbonate. And this is the kind of pathway that weathering can draw down CO2. However, there's been a large body of work, and there's some talks in the series already on these themes, and there's some coming up on these themes, whereby there's another mechanism for getting carbon out of the system on geological timescales, and that's if we preserve organic matter in sediments for long periods of time, and we bury it either in terrestrial or marine deposits. And this organic carbon can be from land, eroded by rivers, or it can be produced in the oceans and linked to detrital particles as well. So this is a really important pathway, and one that I've thought about quite a lot, but I'm not going to talk about at all today, because what we've been trying to focus on is how erosion and weathering can result in these important CO2 sources. So in particular, this green box, which is the organic carbon within rocks being released, being weathered, and the carbon being released as CO2. You can see some flux estimates on some of these boxes, which show you that these are all similar magnitude, which makes it an interesting conundrum how these things counter each other and set the long-term carbon cycle. So I'm not going to be able to answer this question yet, and I don't think we can fully yet. But one of the other motivations is thus to understand how long-term changes in CO2, which is shown here from reconstructions via various techniques to reconstruct atmospheric CO2 across different timescales, here compiled by Foster et al. How these swings in CO2 through geological time, how are erosion and weathering playing a part here? How are they moderating these swings? Are they potentially playing a role in driving some of these swings? And these are really big questions about how the carbon cycle works. A lot of focus has been placed on the Cenozoic, so the second panel over, where we go from 50 million years to present, where we see a decline in CO2 associated with the cooling. Again, these are big picture questions. The other relevance for us, say, in this geochemistry sphere, is that some of these reactions may be modified by how we modify Earth's surface. So if we change erosion through anthropogenic activities, or if we change climate, how do we change these kind of natural carbon processes, and may actually end up impacting the carbon cycle over the next century or more. The CO2 emissions in this conundrum on this long-term carbon cycle are really important to understand. And this is kind of highlighted by a mass balance approach to thinking about the long-term carbon cycle that Berner and Caldera put forward, and others have also discussed. And here's the idea that if you just increase your sinks of CO2, so silicate weathering is shown on this diagram, if we increase this by about 25%, which isn't a huge amount, and nothing else changes, we would draw down all of the atmosphere, all the carbon in the atmosphere and ocean system incredibly quickly on geological timescales. So it's this black line. Within 1 million years, we are removing all of this carbon mass. So it's quite clear that we can't just have the CO2 sinks running away by themselves. And this is why the emissions are invoked to really be driving these long-term patterns. And in this figure, we see the degassing, the volcanic CO2 being shown as increasing by 25%. And it's this that then the weathering sinks, or maybe the organic carbon sinks, will be responding to. But what's interesting about this diagram is if we think about the fact that weathering sedimentary rocks could be a source of CO2, then we end up in an interesting space where weathering isn't just this silicate sink that's drawing down CO2, it could be forcing the carbon cycle through changing CO2 emissions. So I guess the main big question is, how is this working and is it important? And the fluxes, the estimates that we have suggest that these are important processes that we need to better understand. But one of the key things that then spins out of that is that we need to work out, well, what might cause these two pink highlighted boxes to change? Could tectonic processes change and force these two change? Climatic process, climate change and cause these to change. So this is what we're motivated by. And a little bit about the approach. I'll talk about this in detail in a moment. But essentially, we're thinking about a zone here where reactions are occurring, essentially where rocks are in contact with water, the atmosphere, and life, and the interactions between those are driving reactions. And we therefore have a kind of suite of tools to try and understand those reactions. Typically, they can be, you look at what's left behind in the soil or the rock, or you can try and track the products that could be released as gases, or they could be released and moved by waters. And we can do this at quite a small scale, and we can think of it as at almost half a continent scale if we pick the right river, which integrates over very large areas, and that allows us to understand fluxes at a much larger scale. This is what I'm going to talk about today, and hopefully I'm not focusing on a single river, but you'll see strands of how the kind of source to sink perspective and the catchment perspective comes into the research that we do. So the first thing I'm going to do is introduce this CO2 source and how we've tried to understand it, this oxidation of organic carbon in rocks. And we've applied a trace metal proxy to this problem called rhenium. And I'll spend a while talking about what we've learned about that proxy and how it can help, what it can tell us. And then I'm going to shift scales and start looking at the reaction at the outcrop scale instead, and think, well, can we actually measure some of these direct CO2 emissions? And this then calls on some isotope geochemistry using stable isotopes and radiocarbon to track the carbon source. And I'll show you an example that from France, and also from some data that's not out there yet from New Zealand. And actually what we've ended up finding, I'm giving you a big punchline right now, is that the CO2 release from this weathering reaction is linked to temperature, such that as in temperature increases, we increase the CO2 release. And this brings big questions into how we understand weathering in the carbon cycle. So I'll try and end with a bit of a view forward. So just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, CO2 can be released during weathering from two sources. The first is a kind of georespiration. It's an oxidation of organic carbon in rocks. So the organic molecule is simplified here as carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And we essentially respire it and to produce energy, and we release CO2. This could be actually abiotic, but it's highly likely that a lot of this is driven by microbial communities as well, although this is a kind of hot topic of research to try and understand that. The second involves the oxidation, so oxidation again, of sulfide minerals, such as pyrite. And this can produce acidity that can dissolve other phases and result in CO2 release. So the oxidation of a pyrite mineral here, combining oxygen and water to oxidize iron sulfide, producing an oxyhydroxide, which is a solid, and an acid here, H2SO4, sulfuric acid. And this sulfuric acid can be added to a carbonate grain and result in a CO2 release via this stoichiometry here. There are other ways to write these reactions, and there are other ways to oxidize pyrite, and some people in the room might be interested in that. And there's a lot of work being done on this kind of pathway by Mark Torres and Aaron Buffet, and amongst others. So, check out that work if you're interested. I will talk about this towards the end of the talk, though. But what about this georespiration process? Here's an image of a landslide high up in the Andes, in the Cosnapata River in Peru. And you can hopefully see the color of the landslide. That's actually these organic carbon-rich shales that outcrop in this setting, and they're being exposed through the landsliding process to reactions with the atmosphere and water and life. So in this image, actually, we do see some coloration and slightly different colors, and it's telling us that reactions are happening. And I'll show you another image of this. But this really nice review by Hedges and Keel in 1995 actually posed an interesting question about this material. They actually posed, well, why on earth does it react? And they put it in this quite blunt way. They said this stuff has the reactivity of plastic encased in brick, which is probably a bit brutal, but it's fair. We've got rock organic carbon. It can potentially have been under a lot of diagenetic processing, metamorphic processing potentially. So, and it's encased in this kind of rock mass. So how do we oxidize it? Why does it get oxidized? Well, actually, we see evidence for this, in a lot of outcrop situations. This is an extreme example, but from Steve Petch, it's a black shale. So not all sedimentary rocks have this much carbon in it, but this is quite a nice visual way to see, the dark black color on the image are unweathered shales. This is a road cut that's managed to capture some of that weathering process, and we can see the residual left behind where we've got orangey, yellowy colors. This material has been oxidized, and the organic matter has actually been lost from those shales. So this is the kind of visual representation of the process. So if you want to understand this process, we've got a few options. So there's the kind of reaction, very simplified reaction of what might be happening. We have a couple of options. We can look at what's left behind, which is option one. This can be really useful to understand the nature of the organic matter, the nature of organic mineral interactions, but it's quite hard to get flux from just looking at what's left behind in the landscape. The other thing we might be able to do is measure the CO2 coming off directly, and second bit of my talk is going to show you how we've been able to do that. We thought this might not be possible because the fluxes could be quite small, but it turns out we can do it. The other, which I'm going to come on to now, is measuring things that act as a proxy of this reaction. So we're not tracking the carbon directly, we're tracking other products of oxidative weathering that allow us to track the reactions. And so this example here, rhenium as an oxyhydroxide, a soluble anion, I'll come on to in a few slides now. So we're using a proxy that leaves the reaction site in water and is carried away, dissolved in water, while our oxidation product of carbon is escaping as a gas. We have this other product that we can trace in the water. That's the concept. So why rhenium? Why have we ended up, spending an awful lot of time thinking about this? And it's grounded in a few key observations that were made when people started looking into the geochemical cycle of rhenium, particularly Bernard Puka-Ehrenbrink's group. So this is some compiled data that shows a correlation between rhenium concentration and organic carbon concentration in a whole load of sedimentary rocks, but also some marine sediments, modern marine sediments from around the world. And this is just to illustrate first order that we seem to have this link between rhenium and organic carbon in rocks. What's been interesting is there's been a further amount of work done on the rhenium-osmium isotope system, which allows you to potentially date materials. And that work has shown that the rhenium is actually hosted within the organic molecules in some way. And so that makes it it's not just a correlation. We have a link between the organic molecules and the metal that we're trying to trace. So this is a good starting point. The second thing that has been observed that shows that this proxy is worth focusing on is that when you look in a weathering zone, we find a coupled loss of rhenium from the rock as it undergoes weathering and organic carbon from the rock as it undergoes weathering. So, on the other side of the coin, that's brilliant because it means that we've got this kind of coupled loss of the two phases. This is an example from Katie Grant's work. There are others in the published literature already, where we're showing rhenium loss in blue. The little numbers there are proportions of rhenium loss correcting for volume changes. You can then also see the organic carbon in the rock decreasing over this window. And I think a key observation here, while there's variability and there's some similarity between rhenium and carbon and some decoupling of rhenium carbon, there's a stark difference to other phases like pyrite, where you can see the pyrite's all gone quite quickly here, deeper in our weathering profile. So I should say this is with depth. The pyrite's gone, but the rhenium is tracking the organic matter. So this makes it very promising. So what actually Katie thought of doing is like, well, why don't we get a bunch of weathering profiles and try and actually look at how this is playing out? So this is what she did. And this is the result of that work as we're writing up now. So this graph shows you rhenium loss, proportional rhenium loss, where one is you've lost all of the rhenium, and it's normalized to titanium as an element that doesn't get dissolved and it gets left behind in the weathering products. And then we've got organic carbon in the rocks. Again, -1 is all of the organic carbon's been oxidized. It's all gone. And we normalize the titanium again to account for these volume change shifts. So what's interesting about this plot is that those are correlated. We would have been worried about this proxy if they weren't. And a lot of sites are kind of within this the straight line and then a dotted zone, which shows that it's behaving in a remarkably stoichiometric fashion, if you like. But there are also points that lie outside that domain, most of them within this blue domain. And that does suggest that there is some excess rhenium loss. And this makes sense based on our understanding that there must be some rhenium in other phases in the rocks. There must be some rhenium in some silicate minerals or some sulfides. So it would make sense that this would be observed. Other people have also commented that high-grade metamorphism could lead to organic carbon-rich phases that don't have rhenium in them, which are also hard to oxidize. So you get left with a residual of organic carbon that doesn't have any rhenium in it. And that's why we have like this positive intercept. So those two things make sense. And the blue area is kind of the proxy behaving in a good way, is what I would argue. The other reassuring bit from this data compilation, this is new data with some existing data, but mostly it's new, is that when you look at other things like calcium, sodium, magnesium, here I've got calcium and sulfur, you can see rhenium is not correlating in any way with those losses. So again, this is really nicely supporting our use of this tracer. So how do we use it? So I've been talking about evidencing that it works, looking at weathering profiles. Now we want to apply it to calculate an emission of CO2 from a weathering reaction. And ideally, we'd like to do this over quite large areas so we can start to understand this process a bit better. So the idea is that we'll trace the rhenium that was lost from those profiles in the dissolved load of rivers, streams and rivers, and measure the mass flux of rhenium out of the landscape, which is this JRE term. And we can relate that mass flux of rhenium to a carbon flux using some constraint on the initial carbon to rhenium ratio in the rocks that are being weathered. The next term is to say how much of the rhenium is coming from organic carbon. Some could come from sulfides or silicates. And the second is to say, well, some of the organic carbon might be resilient to oxidation. So we make those two corrections. But ultimately, we're measuring rhenium flux. So I'm going to walk you through an example of doing this in the McKenzie River, which is this beautiful image in the background here, where we've done an awful lot of work, and the rhenium is one of the approaches that we've looked into. So talk through a little bit about this large river basin. and it's interesting for our purposes because it's dominated by sedimentary rocks. So A is showing you really large scale here of the Canadian, that's mostly Canada, the North American continent. And you can see the major river system. The middle is showing simplified geological map, but it's simplified to show that most of it's blue, especially the bits within the Rocky Mountains where most of the erosion and weathering is happening. We are dominated by sedimentary rocks. We have also a bit of a zoomed in look at some samples that we took in the Peel River catchment up here near the Delta. I don't know if you can see my cursor actually, but up to the north of the catchment. So we have a bunch of samples from various trips from 2009, 10, 11, 2013, 17, 18, and quite a lot of people have been involved in those trips, and you'll see the papers that we've been writing, you'll see who's involved, and it's a really nice collaborative team across a bunch of institutions. We actually just had a paper published 2 days ago on some McKenzie work done by Melissa Schwab, who's been looking at organic carbon fluxes coming from this large river system. But we know a lot about the other carbon fluxes, so this is another reason we put a lot of effort into the McKenzie. We also managed, through our sampling methods, to capture a range of flows. It's hard with large rivers, and if anyone here who's tried to set up time series collection of materials for trace element or isotopic work, you have to be careful about how you collect those. So it is challenging to do, but we were able to capture a few different parts of the hydrograph. We also benefit here from a lot of work by Christian Miller, who looked at a time series from the McKenzie River from 1 year. So there's some of Christian Miller's samples in here. Essentially, this is just to show you that we're trying to establish how rhenium might vary with water discharge. So the graph on the right shows you rhenium concentration versus water discharge. And what we're trying to do here is just give ourselves the best chance of getting a robust flux estimate. So, it would be fantastic to have, 100 points on this graph. But for our purposes, we don't need 100 points on this graph. We just need to establish, if we calculate the flux using the discharge record, how wrong could we be, or how, because of the dilution effect. And this graph allows us to quantify that uncertainty. So this has kind of been our approach. The other thing we want to do is look at so we've got our flux of dissolved rhenium. The other thing we want to do is look at where it's coming from. So the approach we use here is we combine rhenium with other products of weathering, actually major element products of weathering. So we've got sulfur here in this diagram and sodium. We pick them for good reason. So on the vertical axis, we have rhenium over sulfur. This gives us a way to tease apart potential inputs of rhenium from sulfide weathering, sulfide oxidation. Rhenium to sodium ratios give us a potential way to look at silicate inputs of rhenium. And the way that I'm just going to start showing this is you can see that the squares there are the coal. We have measurements from published data from another study where they measured coal, measured rhenium, sodium, sulfur, and coal. And you can see that that's very rich in rhenium compared to those other phases. So this is what we think the organic carbon in the rocks could be looking like. The red symbols are basalt or gabbroic samples from solids, they're the stars. And the triangles are rivers from Iceland that are draining entirely basaltic rock. So the only rhenium we expect in those places is from silicate minerals. So that gives us constraint on our silicate rhenium. The other thing we have in Canada is a really nice drill core from Ross and Bustin, who measured these variables. And they find that in these shales, well, they didn't comment on this, but when we use their data, we find that in rocks that have high organic carbon content, the blues, they're pulling you up towards very high rhenium content compared to sulfur and sodium. Whereas when we add sulfur to those rocks, they come down that plot. And I've got this arrow saying, well, we think this might be, the trace of rhenium coming in from sulfides. So that the solids give us quite a nice indication of what the sulfide end member might be in that plot. What we then do is look at the water chemistry of these samples. And here I'm now plotting the major outlets of the McKenzie River system. These are filled points, alongside open symbols from tributaries. And the open symbols from tributaries have more variable geochemistry. We see this a lot when we do this type of sampling. And we think that actually there's a 1 point down in the yellow bit that you should be able to spot. That point in the yellow bit is very high in sulfate concentration. And we think that the catchment is experiencing high rates of sulfide oxidation, and that the rhenium in that system is probably dominated by rhenium from sulfides. So it gives us kind of another indication of where the sulfide component is. Then we carry out an unmixing, and we say how much of the rhenium do we think comes from different components. This is a logarithmic plot. And so actually, almost all of these samples are between 70 and 90% of the rhenium coming from organic carbon sources, with the remainder coming from silicate and sulfide sources. So we now know more about the rhenium source, and most of it appears to come from organic carbon in the rock. The final ingredient we need is to know what is the composition of the rocks that are undergoing weathering in terms of their carbon to rhenium ratio. And to get this, we use the river sediments that we've sampled at the same time as we're sampling the waters. And we use, in this plot, you'll see rhenium carbon ratio on the horizontal axis, and you'll see radiocarbon on the vertical axis. And radiocarbon is a useful way to say, well, if we've got no radiocarbon in our sample, it's highly likely to be rock derived. It's millions of years old. Radiocarbon has decayed from that organic matter. And so where we've got 0 on the vertical axis gives us an indication of what the rock might be doing. And the river sediments, it's noisy, but they indicate that the samples where we think we've got the most rock organic carbon, which are these open symbols coming from river bed materials, sandier bits of the river lade, they are suggesting more rock organic carbon, and they give us this rhenium carbon ratio that seems to overlap with some independent measurements from these two shales, the Outcrop and the Liard catchment. So that's kind of reassuring and gives us insight on that carbon rhenium ratio. So essentially we now have each of those ingredients: the rhenium flux, carbon rhenium ratio, how much rhenium's from organic carbon. The fraction graphite I won't mention here, but we argue in the McKenzie that this is likely to be quite minor because of the type of metamorphism associated with the construction of the Rockies and the other mountain ranges. But in other places, it might be a lot higher. So what do I do with all of this? Hopefully this has been interesting, not too technical so far. Well, actually, we're trying to do something quite big picture with this. We're trying to establish what the net flows of carbon are between the atmosphere and sedimentary storage. And so this diagram is trying to get that across. It's got an atmospheric box, and it's got rock storage at the bottom. In the middle, it's got a whole load of reservoirs of carbon that are in the landscape. So we've got silicates, sorry, not reservoirs of carbon, but potential reactants or exchange components, if you like. And this is just for the McKenzie River Basin. We want to know how much carbon could be moved from the atmosphere into storage through the kind of reactions happening in the critical zone. So we've got silicates that can be reacted, carbonates that can weather, and organic carbon in the peat and in the vegetation, which are the green colors, and in the rock, which is the gray. So how does this kind of balance work? And what is the net transfer? Is it a positive or a negative? And actually, this is the first example where we've been able to piece this all together. So first of all, I'll bring in the kind of traditional weathering derived carbon fluxes. So this might look a bit complicated, but I'll explain it hopefully so you can follow what's going on. Silicate weathering will draw down CO2 through carbonic acid attacking the silicates. And that will lead to this 0.52 in this basin being drawn down. Then when we use that bicarbonate to make new calcium carbonate minerals, we draw down 0.6. We draw down half of the moles of carbon. So this is a long-term sink through silicate weathering. The other carbonic acid can be used to weather carbonates. And that's actually a loop of the carbon just goes round. Essentially, you draw carbon down, and then when you make new calcium carbonate, you release it again. So this is a kind of no net gain. That's why we've got 0.8 and then 0.8 coming back round. And I should say where I've got red is trying to illustrate rock carbon moving around. So there we've got rock carbon going from rock to rock. So we're not interested really in that transfer. If we weather the carbonates with sulfuric acid, this is where we can release CO2. So this has been quantified by a couple of studies in the McKenzie. And when that happens, we end up with a red line going from the rocks to the atmosphere. So this wasn't our work, this was earlier work. And just quickly look at that number, it's 0.7 going back to the atmosphere. It's higher than the silicate weathering drawdown by quite a way, actually. So just considering those reactions, it looks like weathering in the McKenzie Basin is a source of CO2. Organic carbon comes to the rescue here. So in this basin, we erode a lot of soil and vegetation, and we transfer it to the delta and to the shallow marine, deeper marine environment. And we estimate that that draws down 1.9 tons of carbon per square kilometre per year. And you can see that that sink allows you to kind of counter those inorganic reactions. We also move organic carbon from the landscape and rocks, and we put it back in sediments. And that's like no net transfer to the atmosphere. The final bit of the puzzle then, which is the rhenium bit that I was talking to you about, shows that we release CO2. And this is kind of what we end up with in terms of a net balance. So we're trying to put these key things together. And we end up in this paper telling the story that this is currently situated, this big basin, as a net CO2 drawdown, but via a mechanism that we don't necessarily deal with very well when we think about the long-term carbon cycle. We definitely have a tendency to write more, I guess, about silicate weathering and its role as a CO2 drawdown, whereas actually here, it looks like the organic carbon erosion and burial is actually really important. So moving on, I'm just going to show you something even probably more complicated. I took time to walk through this, but oh no, wait, pause. Brain moving too fast. What we've then done is try, we're making wider sampling of rivers. We're trying to establish this rhenium proxy. We're trying to use it. So this is an example from a recent paper. I'm just showing you the type of sampling that we do, sampling through time, collecting materials, running them for trace metal concentrations, and we're calculating rhenium fluxes. So these are examples from 2 Swiss catchments and a East River case study that got published at the end of last year. But the point here is to say that we're trying to build up these catchment-based studies where we have all of these components. And I don't want to get too much into this. Please do check out this paper if you're interested. If you can't get access, email me. But here we're trying to look at this balance between silicate weathering, sulfide oxidation, so that's a sink and a source, and organic carbon burial as a sink, and rock organic carbon oxidation as a source. I'm trying to look at how these play out. Can we see basins that are sources, basins that are sinks, basins that are within uncertainty of being net nothing, if you like. And in this review paper, we're trying to speculate, well, how does this balance play out? And there's just not enough data at the moment, but we were trying to think about it in terms of sulfide content in the rocks and erosion rate being an important component. So I won't go too much into this. I'm aware that this slide's quite complicated, but just wanted to flag that. Coming back to the specific process of rock organic carbon oxidation, well, what have we learned from the rhenium proxy? So this is this paper that came out where we just compiled the data that's available. And this does look like if we increase erosion rate, and the horizontal axis there is a proxy for erosion rate, suspended sediment yield. If we increase erosion rate, we can increase this release of carbon dioxide from rock organic carbon oxidation. This is often described as a supply limited case. If we can supply more minerals through erosion, we can release or we can react more. And in this case, we can release more CO2. And from the perspective of a geomorphologist, this is quite interesting, right? Erosion is driving a CO2 release. However, there's some scatter in this diagram, and some of the scatter could be really interesting because it could tell us about other factors other than supply that are affecting this release. And they could be climatic in nature, actually. But before I go on to that, I'm just going to show a new compilation that we've done using Christian Miller's global rhenium data. This includes a whole load of large rivers around the world, where we're trying to basically get a better idea on the global fluxes that are involved. So this is work that's still ongoing. Jesse Zondervan is looking at empirical data, but also building a spatially explicit model. So here we're looking at just 18% of river basins discharged to the ocean, and then upscaling that. So this is the kind of crudest estimate that we can come up with. And we get an estimate of 100 megatons. I asked Jesse, is it 100? Because that looks a bit strange when you put it on a slide, and it is 100 with a large uncertainty range. But it means this looks a bit higher than we were expecting. So this is ongoing work, and we're gonna, you'll hear more about this hopefully over the coming months. And Jesse has an invited talk at EGU if anybody is going along, so you can check that out. But I'll come back to the scatter. The scatter on this diagram. I should say the colors on this diagram are just the left, just so you know, it's the longitude of the river. So you can see that we've got quite a global compilation here. But what about the potential for other controls? And I've got about, I'm a bit 10 minutes, 15 minutes to give you a bit of a whirlwind tour of a different approach to this problem where we've shed light on something interesting, we think. So here we're going to have a bit of a shorter component and change tack a little bit, moving away from rhenium and more towards, can we actually measure the CO2 fluxes? Here is a landscape covered in a marl, Jurassic marl, that's got lots of organic carbon in rocks, carbonate minerals, sulfide minerals, and it's eroding incredibly quickly. This is the director of the observatory, Caroline Lebutier, and Sebastian Klotz, who's the research scientist who's based at the site. So we've been working a lot with the infrastructure that's already there. I'll just show you a short video. Some of you may have seen this before. But here is a landscape where these sedimentary rocks are exposed to weathering, oxidative weathering by oxygen. You can see these bare surfaces. They're rapidly eroding. They're supplying new material all the time to be reacted. There's some areas with forest cover, but a lot of the area is exposed. There's an interesting side question, which is actually this exposure of this rock is anthropogenically induced. And so there's a bit of a side question here about how that has influenced fluxes that I won't talk about today, but interesting to bear in mind. And this landscape is kind of common in this part of France. So we're in this window where these rocks are eroding really quickly and they're being exposed. And you may be familiar with this type of landscape and, closer to your own institution as well. It's not a unique type of sedimentary rock. So what we thought was, well, let's try and measure this. And Guillaume Soulet started in the Rock CO2 project with an idea just to simply say, can we see enough CO2? Number one. Number two, can we prove that it comes from rocks? And they were our two initial objectives. So we came up with an idea to measure these fluxes using a chamber-based approach. But a chamber, when you're measuring CO2 fluxes, you can place on a surface and accumulate gases. However, for us, that was less than ideal because we thought the fluxes might be quite small and we didn't want atmospheric leaks of gas, of CO2 into the system. Also, we wanted to be able to come back to these same chambers again and again. And if we put these chambers on the surface in this erosive environment, they're just going to get washed away. So we internalized the chamber. We made a hole in the rock face that could collect the gases that are naturally kind of coming out of fractures that are water and gas are reacting with minerals. So we're trying to capture a natural process within the rock face. And this diagram on the right shows how we then manipulate the gases to measure CO2 concentration, but also to trap the CO2 so we can take it back to the lab. This is an example of what it looks like in front of a chamber for a few hours. You're measuring CO2 using an infrared gas analyzer, and you basically, this is common in soil sciences, you strip the CO2 to an atmospheric level, so 400 ppm or something like this, and then you let the CO2 build up over time, and that tells you about the release of CO2, and then you get your CO2 back out, and you carry on. And this is how we get CO2 flux. We also trap the CO2, and we trap enough that we can look at radiocarbon and stable isotopes of carbon to look at the source. And we did this in a bunch of chambers. I said that this was an outcrop-based approach. So you can see we're just focusing on this one north-facing outcrop in this critical zone observatory. What we found was that, one, yes, we could measure the fluxes, and two, by the third trip, we were kind of blown away because we were seeing large variability. Here, we visited in summer and we found much larger fluxes than the winter trips. We were also starting to see some differences between the chambers that we'd installed. So here you see two chambers, CO2 fluxes, and this is the average of one measurement at the site. So there's multiple measurements per trip. So you'll see 2 dots or 3 dots, depending on how many times we connected during the trip. And the black line is the temperature in the chambers, where we have a temperature probe measuring that. And yeah, at this point of the experiment, it's quite exciting already. And when then we revisited for the subsequent seasonal analysis, we started to see the seasonal variability in the CO2 release from these sedimentary rocks. We see a difference between the two chambers, but they're showing the same pattern of their total CO2 flux. Essentially, seasonal in nature, so warmer temperatures associated with higher fluxes of CO2. And just without anything else, no processing, no binning, nothing, just what's the temperature, what's the CO2 flux, and correlating them across all our measurements, this is what we find. So again, this is something that we find in soil science studies and looking at the surface, plant litter and stuff like this. As you increase temperature, you increase your CO2 release. And you can define that increase by a factor called Q10. It describes the exponential relationship. And it says, over 10 degrees, how much do I change my CO2 flux by what factor? So you can see the Q10 values on that plot are 1.8 and 1.9, and they're within uncertainty of 2. Essentially, that means that over 10 degrees, you will double your CO2 flux. And you can see the chambers are different, but they have the same behavior. So very briefly, don't have much time to get into this, but we think that the differences between the chambers are related to the relative position in the landscape, which relates to the relative air-filled versus water-filled porosity. And I'm going to leave it at that because I don't have time to go into it, but if you're interested, read the papers we've been talking about. Now what we do is we normalize the fluxes so that each chamber is looking at a relative flux. And when we do that, it's again quite remarkable that they all start to collapse, and we see this kind of common response over here, 4 chambers over 2.5 years, where we see these increases and decreases in flux. We also have a really interesting observation Guillaume captured on a very intense measurement campaign in 2019, where he was measuring these chambers frequently. We actually see some evidence that after a rainfall event, we remove some of the carbon in dissolved form, and this makes the flux less for about 24 hours, and then it increases again. So this climate's quite dry. So this, if you're thinking about this method, it's interesting to think, well, am I going to be able to pass out temperature and hydrological control? At this site, the temperature control completely dominates the story. And then just to combine the two plots, one is unnormalized and the other is normalized, where you've got all of the chambers together with one single relationship between temperature and CO2 flux. And that Q10 value suggests that this stuff is is reactive to temperature. It's as temperature sensitive as some soil organic matter in terms of how much extra CO2 is released as you increase temperature. Hopefully, you've been thinking, well, where's that CO2 from? I haven't actually shown you that it's from the rock yet, but is it from organic matter or carbonates? And actually, it's from both in this catchment. I'm actually going to skip that slide. I'm going to go to this slide. So this slide allows us to unpack sources of the gas. So on the horizontal axis, we've got stable isotopes. On the vertical axis, we've got radiocarbon. Radiocarbon of 1 is associated with 1950 atmosphere. You can see some atmosphere measurements that we've made at the site. They're stars, so you see that they're high in radiocarbon. We can use the stable isotopes to then unpack rock organic matter, which has no radiocarbon and then is isotopically light, versus carbonate, which is isotopically heavy with no radiocarbon. And at one chamber, we've got more of that, we've got more radiocarbon depletion, so they're the dark blues. And at another chamber, we've got more radiocarbon enrichment. And to explain the radiocarbon enrichment, we have a process whereby we think you produce a dissolved pool of inorganic carbon through that reaction shown there. So the blue is atmospheric CO2 and the red is rock carbon. So we produce a dissolved pool that's a 50-50 mixture, and that's the blue box on the diagram. And then what we do is we add some sulfuric acid to that pool, and we can release the CO2 from it. The other source is the red dots. If we add some sulfuric acid to the red dots, we'll release CO2 with that composition. And then the final component is the organic matter that we can oxidize within the rocks. So we do a 3-component mixing and partition the source. In this case, I won't go into there's nothing too much to say about those relative sources. The key thing is that when you partition the sources, the organic derived flux and the carbonate derived flux are both increasing with temperature, and they both show similar responses to temperature. Paul, I don't know how much time I've got, but I can go through a whirlwind. This is in review from Tobias. How much time have I got, Paul?
Well, maximum five minutes.
So I won't go into the details of the method again, but I'll just show you another example of something like this where we've done it over a week instead of over 2.5 years. And actually, remarkably, over a week, we had enough temperature variation. So I'll just skip to the this catchment in New Zealand, the star shows you that all of the CO2 we measured in these chambers in New Zealand was from rock organic carbon. There was no carbonate derived component in this system because the carbonate and sulfide contents of rocks are much lower than in France. But we still see this link between air temperature in this case, because we didn't have good chamber temperature data, and the CO2 release. And so these are two different ways of kind of filtering the data. But the data on the left is the raw data, and the data on the right is filtering for kind of hydrological variability. This is measurements made over 7 days. We're able to recover how temperature sensitive these fluxes are. So with that remaining 3 minutes or so, I'm going to try and provide a bit of a synthesis. Our textbook view is that silicate weathering provides a negative feedback. So it draws down more CO2 as you warm the planet. So here's the reaction. Here's an example of showing as you increase temperature, you increase weathering of silicate minerals and you draw down more CO2. And this is well established, and there's various data sets looking into this. What we've shown is that rock organic carbon can potentially be a positive feedback on climate. As you increase temperature, you increase the CO2 released by this process. And that raises some really interesting questions about how then the long-term carbon cycle actually operates. We've also been able to, by combining rhenium at the catchment scale and these detailed gas measurements, we've been able to kind of say, well, what's controlling this? And it looks like a lot of places on Earth's surface if we increase erosion, we will increase the CO2 release from weathering. However, maybe at higher erosion, we start seeing a climatic control where this flux could get larger if it's warmer and could decrease if it's cooler. So this is very much, data limited, but based on our observations, this kind of framework could be what's happening, and we need an awful lot of focus to try and unpack this. And so I'll summarize with some key take-homes. The first one is I'd say that oxidative weathering can be a big flux, can be bigger than silicate weathering drawdown. Lithology is clearly important here. I've spent the whole talk talking about sedimentary rocks. If we had volcanic island arcs, we're not going to have these processes operating. And this observation that we could have a positive feedback on a system, which raises a whole load of spin-out questions. I would propose there's lots for geomorphologists and people interested in source to sink processes to do. One is measuring these things. One is saying, well, how do floodplains play a role in this story? What's the role of things like landslides that can have local effects on erosion and oxidation reactions? And also those of us who are trying to build these models that predict or invert proxies. Like, I think this is a really interesting avenue. So with that, I'll stop. I'll just thank the funders again and a whole host of collaborations that are ongoing and been really enjoyable. And just thank everybody who's been involved. And thank you for coming along and listening. And I'll take any questions, or you can feel free to email me as well. Thanks.
Fantastic, Bob. This is great. It's very, very informative. And I think I need to rewatch your talk and read the paper carefully to comprehend it fully. So let's go ahead. Somebody need to run also. Weijun, go ahead.
Well, this is a great talk, really eye-opening. Now we know the traditional view of the carbonate and silicate weathering as a sink of atmospheric CO2, and we also know organic matter oxidation release CO2. Beginning, I keep thinking, which one is really more important as far as taking atmospheric CO2 is concerned. So at the end of your first part of talk, you put a synthesis slides. Can you go back to that slides? I'm still a little, unsure, because you combined the modern CO2 flux into that.
Is it this one?
No, the end of the first one, you have multiple arrows and boxes. Actually,
this one?
Yeah. So here you put the continental organic matter with a biosphere flux into that, and actually you put there we know that photosynthesis must have a net organic matter accumulation, and that will eventually goes to the ocean. But if we look at the net of the rock weathering, carbonate, silicate weathering versus organic matter send the CO2 back, when you bring the biosphere flux in, it complicates the issue, make it the question whether the geological rock weather that is inorganic carbon part versus organic one, the net rate are not clear. If you will remove the biosphere part, can you, because your conclusion is actually the rock weathering is the source of CO2 to the atmosphere.
This is true. This
is true.
Actually,
I was teaching this part 2 weeks ago, this organic matter cycling versus rock weathering. On geological timescale, rock weathering is still a little bit larger, so it's a net sink. So now you tell me this is a source, and mainly it's because that sulfide, hydrogen sulfate weathering part actually make it. If you take that 0.71 off, then it will still be a sink, right? So that is the key part. Can you explain that a little further? Yeah,
sure, Weijun. If I understand the comment question properly, I think one of the things I would respond and say, this is a big basin, right? It's a large, McKenzie River is a large basin, but it's odd in terms of it's dominated by sedimentary rocks. So a lot of basins are not this dominated by sedimentary rocks. Some are. It also has a lot of sulfide minerals, apparently, based on the water chemistry. Again, not every river has that type of rock chemistry. So it might be that in some basins that 0.71, that release during sulfuric acid is lower. And I didn't talk much about the global flux or how that varies, but that's much more uncertain. But even if you take that out of the equation, I think that it's becoming quite clear that anywhere you've got sedimentary rocks, the organic carbon in those rocks could outweigh your silicate weathering drawdown. So this kind of it puts a big onus on igneous lithologies. It means that those places, the silicate weathering in those places kind of has to be playing a role. Or I see your point about organic carbon burial. You have to think of that separately because it's not technically rock. It's not to do with the rock weathering. It's a different kind of process path. But I would argue that there's a lot of evidence to suggest, in the Himalayan system, that most of the carbon drawdown is through organic carbon burial. We find the same thing in the McKenzie. And I think there's a growing recognition that, how silicate weathering and organic carbon burial must be doing something in tandem to kind of, I guess, counter these CO2 release pathways. So I haven't really given a clear answer, but I think the bottom line is we need to do more things like this, in more locations and see how this parameter space evolves. And that could be field measurements, but it could also be modeling, right? We can think about how, under what scenario can we have net sinks, and under what scenario can we have net sources, and think about this. I think it's fascinating. Anyway, I don't know if that answers or addresses the comment.
So really, is the question how well does McKenzie River represent a global picture? Need to be
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Also, from a marine sedimentology point of view, timing also a key. For a long time, million-year scale deposition, sedimentary rock, definitely storage is the sink. But the weathering process definitely tend to release. That's here we talk about mainly the very short time scale molding process, definitely releasing. But anyway, that's fascinating. We need to pay more attention on that topic. Okay, let's see. Any other people? If you have any question, just unmute yourself. Bob, there's some question in the chat room. Are you able to see the chat?
Oh yeah, let me just I'll just get to the end. Oh yeah, okay, I see it. Let me have a go. Oh, I see Valier. I think Valier is probably talking about this in a few weeks. Valier Gully is just commenting that we see similar balances in the Bengal.
In the beginning,
I'll get to the top. So Aaron has a question about how to differentiate rhenium from petrogenic, so the rock organic carbon, and the biological derived organic carbon. We don't think that rhenium ends up in terrestrial organic matter or marine organic matter. We think the association with rhenium is happening in diagenesis, during marine diagenesis. So as you make the sedimentary rocks, essentially. So in that respect, we've measured like surface soils in Taiwan, for example, and they have very little rhenium. We can barely measure it. So it means that rhenium is not coming from the biospheric organic carbon. Dan, is it possible to estimate the atmospheric residence time of CO2? Yes, and I believe that's relatively common to think about in terms of especially anthropogenic CO2 emissions. I don't know if it's so relevant here. And there's also, the question of, on geological timescales, we don't just think of the atmosphere, we think of the atmosphere, ocean, biosphere system together. So on like timescales of 10,000 years or so, that's the grouping that matters. But yeah, no, certainly we can people quantify this, residence time, and it's a useful way to think about the carbon cycle. Oh yeah, so actually Longfei Gu has actually replied to my earlier question with there is not much rhenium in biological carbon. I agree with that. We have a question, can you comment on the difference in the apparent temperature dependency of oxidative weathering versus silicate carbonate weathering? Is it comparable? That's a fantastic question. We had that in review. So this is basically, we've got that Q10 value. So we've got temperature versus CO2 release. And the Q10 tells us that in 10 degrees, we double the CO2 release. Now, what's kind of fascinating is if we look at the data from Gouger and Lee's basalt weathering study, so CO2 drawdown by silicate weathering, you can compute a Q10 value of 2. So, make of that what you will, because this is quite limited amount of studies, but it looks like the temperature sensitivity could be quite similar. But I would argue it's going to depend on the nature of the organic matter, for starters, oxygen supply, and then for silicate weathering, I'd say it depends on the nature of the mineral and the nature of the acid supply. So I think that I wouldn't read too much into that comparison at the moment, but it's certainly where ideally we'd like to get, right? We'd like to say, well, I'd like either people to say, no, Bob, you guys, you're completely wrong. There's no positive feedback. It doesn't work, which is hard to argue with our data. But it might be that at scale, it's not important. Or, we have this fascinating thing where the CO2 release and the CO2 drawdown seem to have the same temperature sensitivity. And that seems like it should be completely fortuitous to me. Let's see where we end up. Yeah. Is there any other question? There is a come back on rhenium, being stored. I'm not closing this off. I think that rhenium could be one of the places we do find rhenium in the surface is when you've got anthropogenic deposition of rhenium from coal burning and steel manufacture can deposit rhenium on the landscape. So for instance, in Pennsylvania, we have a river in Pennsylvania where we think all of the rhenium is anthropogenic. So the Wei Sang Cheng, can the historic fossil carbon oxidation be reflected by measuring the rhenium content in the sediment core? I think that's an interesting question. I think it's complicated. A lot of you on this call will know more about this type of thing than I do, but my understanding is if you do that, you've got to try and work out what you're measuring. Are you measuring orthogenic rhenium, which could tell you about seawater or lake water rhenium? Or are you measuring detrital rhenium, which just tells you about the rocks that were being eroded? So I think it could, but no one's looked at it. I think it needs some really careful method testing before I would apply that. And then Chan Sheng asks, seems a dissolution of calcium carbonate and oxidation of organic carbon show different impacts on the carbon cycle. While the former may be balanced by sedimentary calcium carbonate, will the effect of oxidative weathering I'm not sure I understand the question, but
okay, Bob, we can leave the question here, so we can open them. Tom, you want to ask any question or already type here?
Tom, you might have to follow up with that because I'm not sure. What do you mean, salt tectonics? I know what you mean, but what do you mean in this context?
Can we ask a different question? What is the implication for the current CDR strategies? Maybe you can say a little bit.
That's an interesting. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Well, the current CDR strategies, involving silicate weathering, are completely unnatural, right? We're proposing to put ground up silicate minerals onto agricultural fields to enhance silicate weathering by massively increasing the supply of silicate weathering. No one's proposing to grind up shale and put it, I hope, and put it on farmers' fields, because that would clearly be a bad idea based on what we found. So I think there's clearly more testing that needs to be done from the silicate weathering, enhanced weathering mechanism of CDR. There's a lot of work in that space. But I think you've got to remember that we're using a natural reaction, but to make it work, you have to put it on turbocharge. Whereas these processes,
Yes,
they might
you're
increase.
right, and this could make it worse.
Yeah, well, so the way that this goes is that I suppose over the next 100 years, could this flux increase naturally due to warming, but also due to anthropogenic erosion, that we've enhanced erosion. And I don't think we know the answer to that, but I would speculate that the flux is probably it's not small enough to not worry about, but it makes CDR even more important, right? Because there might be bits of the carbon cycle that release CO2 that we don't, and they don't have to be huge, but if we're trying to get to net zero, it means we have to try and counter them. That makes sense.
Okay.
I think this makes the call for CDR even more.
Bob, I was asking about more like in relation to what's known with rhenium and the vaporites.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, that's a nice question. Not a lot we know about that. I think so we have that basin in France that I was showing you. So we've been measuring rhenium in that stream. I didn't have time to go into that. And it looks really interesting. We don't really have any need to invoke, and I should say that basin has some gypsum, but we don't really have any evidence to say that like we need a source of rhenium from evaporites. What could be really interesting though, is if evaporites are preserving some record of, rhenium concentration in a lake or an ocean. That would be fascinating, right? Because one of the things that we were asked about it earlier, how might we look back in the past, and we're scratching our heads. We need to doing all of this modern river studies. It can be powerful, but what we need to understand is how has this changed over time, and that's really we're scratching our heads how to get at that.
Yeah, I think looking at some of them in and around the Mediterranean with respect to the Miocene change would be interesting. Anyway, that's where I was going with that. That's what I meant by salt tectonics. But I'll stop there. Enjoyed it tremendously.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, before we end, so I will see in advertisement in 1 month from now, in end of April 27, Valley Galley, he will come here talk about the Himalaya, the Ganges, carbon discharge. I think he's still around here. So please mark your calendar, April 27. So I think they will be matched this topic that will be further extended to the ocean. So see if anybody have a last question, or if no question, we can stop here. Anybody?
This is a really big question. So the big question is, how do we stabilize Earth's temperature if we have this in the system? Yeah, fully agree. I'm not saying silicate weathering isn't a negative feedback. I'm just saying maybe there's a positive feedback, and that makes modeling the carbon cycle actually quite different. If you have a system with a forcing, it actually, if you think about how we model these things, it actually makes it kind of fascinating, because you could probably have perturbations that you wouldn't necessarily produce if you just have one stabilizing feedback. So I think it's fascinating, and we've only got limited data on that positive feedback, so we clearly need more. But hopefully it opens a door to lots of people thinking about it as well. And I think, as hopefully you got it out of this talk, that it was a sort of a surprise that we found this seasonal variability. We were just hoping to be able to measure it. We weren't expecting it to be as responsive to temperature. So, kind of partly stumbled across that, if you like. But it means, I think there's a lot of doors open here to other field work, lab experiments that are really nicely controlled. There's lots of people who are experts on that. Yeah, see where we end up.
That's fantastic, Bob. As Vijay said, this really open eyes, open, inspiring talk. This is fantastic. Now, with your talk about the river catchment, and then, Edward Tip talk about also river flow to the delta. And now we're looking forward to the valleys talk, all the way from Himalaya to the deep sea fan. So now we gradually get a little bit big picture, So thank you so much for
Thank
this
you so much for the
contribution.
invite.
And
great.
so we keep in touch. And if Anna, we're looking forward. You also give a talk here. So don't keep silent.
Oxford double header. That's brilliant.
Okay.
See you.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much. See you next week.